Imagine you are a young Canaanite. You have married today with the woman you love, but when arrives the night, it's not you who the will take to bed for the first time. In his place, a priest or a leader of the city will take that right, in name of the gods. This was the reality in some cities of Canaan, a land rich in culture, but also in customs that today would seem to us unthinkable. But how started this practice? Was it a privilege of the elite or an obligation imposed on all brides? And more importantly, how was this ritual justified within the society Canaanite? To understand it, first must to enter into in the history of Canaan, a territory coveted by great empires, with fortified cities, rituals bloody, and a daily life marked by the religion and war. It was a land where the gods they controlled everything from the harvests until marriage. In this video, we will discover as they really lived Canaanites, how their city-states functioned, and why their practices were considered abominable by the Hebrews, who arrived in this region led by Joshua. We will analyze the role of the women, the cults of Baal and Astarte, and the cultural conflict that transformed Canaan forever. But before we go on, tell me, have you ever heard about this ancient rite of the first night? Get ready, because what you are about to discover will forever change your vision of the ancient world. Canaan was not a unified kingdom. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, it did not have a pharaoh, neither an emperor who ruled all the territory. In its place was divided into city-states, each with his own king, his own army, and its own gods. This the converted in a region in constant conflict, where the alliances could change from one day for another, and the betrayals were currency current. Located between two of the most powerful civilizations of the antiquity, Canaan was a strategic bridge between Egypt of the pharaohs and the empire's Mesopotamians, such as Babylon and Assyria. His geographical position that made it extremely valuable for trade, but also the eye was coming back vulnerable to invasions. Caravans loaded with gold, spices and slaves their paths crossed, but also they did the armies that sought conquer her. The cities of Canaan were fortified to resist attacks. Jericho, for example, had walls up to 6 meters high, which makes it converted in one of the more difficult places to take. Other cities like Lachish and Hazor also were known for their impressive defenses. However, this political fragmentation had one problem. Canaan could never join together to defend themselves from external invaders, which would facilitate his fall when the Israelites arrived. The kings of these cities were not only military leaders, but also religious figures. On many occasions, the priests had more power than the own rulers, since they considered themselves the intermediaries between the gods and the village. This is where it comes in game, the ritual of the first night. Like the sacrifices and the offerings, it was believed that this act assured the fertility and the prosperity of the community. But to understand why these rituals were so important, first must know, as I really lived a Canaanite common. How were their houses, their food and daily life? In the next chapter, we will explore the day-to-day of the inhabitants of this enigmatic land. Life in Canaan. It took place between the work, the family and the rituals dedicated to the gods. Most of the population was peasant and lived in villages close to the cities walled, while the nobility and priests resided in palaces or temples within the cities. The houses were made of mud and stone, with flat roofs that served to dry food or as a resting place during the warm nights. In its interior, there was a single room with a small kitchen and a domestic altar, where they were placed offerings daily to the gods protectors of the home. The family structure was patriarchal. The father had absolute authority over his wife and children, although the women, they fulfilled an essential role in the administration of the home, the upbringing and the production of textiles and food. Some of them, especially the belonging to families noble or priestly, could obtain a high status within the society. Canaan's economy was based in agriculture and trade. In the fertile valleys of the Jordan, the peasants grew wheat, barley, figs, grapes and olives, while in the coast, the merchants, they exported oils, spices and purple fabrics to Egypt and Mesopotamia. The artisans produced pottery, bronze tools and weapons, but the wealth was concentrated in the elite's rulers. The peasants paid high taxes to the temples and to the kings of the city-states, which are maintained in a constant struggle for the subsistence. Marriage in Canaan was not for love, but an agreement between families that benefited economically to both parties. The woman should arrive virgin at marriage because her purity was considered a symbol of honor for her family. However, there was one disturbing exception. In some cities, before consummating the union with her husband, the bride should pass the first evening with a priest or a local ruler. This rite had a religious justification and was believed to guarantee fertility and divine protection for marriage. Some women also, they were given to the temples as servants of the gods, where they exercised the sacred prostitution in honor of the goddess Astarte. This practice, although seen as an act of devotion, reinforced a domain of the religion on the life of the Canaanites and consolidated the power of the priestly caste. Religion influenced every aspect of daily life. There was no decisions without consulting the gods, and the priests exercised absolute control over the people. For them, the gods, they demanded constant worship and sacrifices, and in times of crisis, the tributes were not enough. When the drought whipped the land or wars threatened the cities, the offerings became more extreme. It was not enough with burn incense or deliver cattle. The gods, they asked for human blood. The elite and the priests were in charge of selecting the victims, that many times were children from humble families. These sacrifices were carried out on altars built in the top of the cities, so that the gods could see them with clarity and grant his favor. For the Canaanites, these practices were the guarantee of a prosperous future. For the village's foreigners were barbaric rites that had to be eradicated. With the arrival of the Hebrews to Canaan, the brutality of these traditions became in one of the main reasons which the Israelites justified the destruction of the city's Canaanites. But before the invasion Hebrew, the religion already completely dominated the society Canaanite, shaping everything from marital relationships to power structure. And if there was something that the gods they demanded, was absolute obedience. In Canaan, the religion was not just one aspect of life, but the center of the whole society. Every daily activity, from farming to marriage, was linked to the worship of the gods. Did not exist separation between the sacred and the earthly. Everything revolved around the divinities, and the priests exercised absolute power over the population. The city-states. They had their own temples and cults, but throughout the region predominated two great deities, Baal and Astarte. Baal was the most revered god in Canaan. It represented the fertility, the rain and war. It was believed that he ruled the storms and that their rage could destroy crops whole if not surrendered the worship due. Farmers depended on it for their income, good harvests, while the warriors they invoked his protection in the battles. On the other hand, Astarte was the goddess of war, the lust, and the fertility. Her cult was associated with rituals sexual, already the sacred prostitution. Their priestesses not only directed the temples, but also participated in ceremonies where the carnal union symbolized the connection with the goddess. In the temples, the priests organized festivals with banquets, dances, and rituals that could last for days. It was believed that by participating in these acts, people claimed the prosperity of its city. However, when the time were difficult, the gods were not satisfied with simple celebrations. They were required sacrifices. The Canaanites, they believed that blood had a special power to appease the divinities. Animal sacrifice was common, but in times of crisis, human lives were offered. The belief was simple and terrifying. How much elderly out he sacrifice, greater I would be the reward of the gods. One of the most feared rites were the child sacrifice. In times of drought or war, the most humble families were forced to hand over their children to be burned in honor of Baal or Moloch, a deity they offered victims in braziers burning. The crying of the children were drowned out by the sound of drums and chants, while the priests proclaimed that the blood would bring the blessing of the gods. Archaeology has found remains of incinerated children on altars in cities Canaanites, which confirms the brutality of these practices. These rituals not only ensured the protection of the gods, but also reinforced the social hierarchy. The priests, by controlling the communication with the divinities, they had absolute power over the rulers and the people. No one dared to defy his orders, as it was believed that the disobedience could bring the wrath of the gods. Sacred prostitution also was part of this control system. It was considered an act of devotion, where the women, they offered his body as a channel to receive the blessing of Astarte. In some cases, the youths, they were delivered to the temples as girls, destined to serve as priestesses until the gods, it decided. Within this religious context, the rite of the first evening charged a special meaning. It was not just a social tradition, but a ritual that reinforced the authority of the priests and the connection between the gods and the community. In some cities, it was believed that the fertility of a woman, it was to be consecrated first to the gods before being given to her husband. For this reason, in some marriages, the first night of the girlfriend was not with her husband, but with a priest or a ruler who represented the gods in the earth. This act, far from being seen as an offense, was considered an honor, since it meant that the marriage was blessed by the divinities. For the Canaanites, the religion was not a choice, but an imposition. Every aspect of life was regulated by the temples and their rituals. Obedience to the gods guaranteed the stability, while the challenge brought relentless punishments. But not everyone accepted these rituals without question them. With the arrival of the Hebrews, these practices were condemned as abominations, and the struggle between monotheism and paganism would be changed forever. The history of Canaan. However, before the Israelites imposed their own laws, the rite of the first evening, it was already an established custom. In the next chapter, we will explore in detail as how this disturbing ritual worked and what was its impact on the society Canaanite. In the cities of Canaan, marriage was not an act of love, but a contract between families, a transaction that strengthened alliances and ensured the economic stability. However, for many women, the wedding night did not mean the consummation of marriage with her husband, but the obligation to comply with a ritual that today would result unthinkable. In some regions, existed the belief that the fertility of a woman, it was to be consecrated first to the gods before belonging to her husband. For this reason, the first night of the girlfriend was not with her husband, but with a priest or a ruler who acted as a divine intermediary. The ritual had deep religious roots and was linked to the cult of the fertility, especially that of the goddess Astarte. It was believed that being possessed by a representative of the divinity, the women received the blessing of the gods to have children strong and healthy. In some cities, this was done in the temples, where the youths were carried in procession while the community celebrated with chants and dances. In others, it was the own ruler who claimed this right as a symbol of their authority over the people. This privilege, reserved for the elite, reinforced the social hierarchy and the domain of the priests and the kings over the population. Historical records and references in ancient texts suggest that these types of practices existed in several civilizations, from Mesopotamia to certain regions of Europe. In Canaan, the rite of the first night was not universal in all cities, but in those where it was practiced, it was seen as a sacred obligation. For many families, deliver to their daughter to a priest was an honor, as it meant that her lineage had been elected by the gods. However, for the women, this tradition represented a complete loss of control over his own destiny. Not all of them couples. They accepted this ritual without resistance. There have been indications that some men, they tried to challenge the tradition, refusing to allow their wives to be given to the temples. but going against the priests and the gods could have consequences terrible. A man who opposed the practice could be punished with the expulsion of the community or even with the death. The woman, for her part, was marked as impure, which could mean the rejection of your own family and condemnation to a life of servitude or prostitution. The psychological impact of this tradition in the women is difficult to imagine from our modern perspective. They knew from a young age that their destiny did not depend on them, but on the decisions of their parents and the will of the gods. Submission was imposed from the childhood, and those who were chosen for the right of first, they didn't have neither other option to accept your destiny. For the Canaanites, this ritual was not a violation, neither an abuse, but an act necessary to ensure the harmony with the gods. It was believed that the fertility of a woman was directly connected with the prosperity of the community. If the rite was not performed correctly, it was feared that divine wrath would bring diseases, droughts, or defeats in war. The priests used these fears to consolidate their power, making sure that no one questioned his authority. With the arrival of the Hebrews to Canaan, this practice was harshly condemned. The Israelites, who followed a completely different moral and legal structure, considered these customs as acts of corruption and decadence. In their sacred texts, they described the Canaanites as a wicked people, whose destruction was necessary to establish a new society based in the law of his only God. However, beyond the religious justifications, the elimination of these practices also was part of a cultural and political conflict. The Hebrews not only wanted to eradicate the traditions Canaanites, but also to destroy the power system that the priests and kings locals had established for centuries. The war against Canaan was not just a war of territories, but a war of beliefs, where the control over the sexuality and the family juice a crucial role. But although the Israelites destroyed many Canaanite cities and temples, the "I remember these practices" was left recorded in the history. Throughout the centuries, records and references to these customs have been found in ancient texts, which shows that, although today they are shocking to us, the past was seen as part of a sacred and unquestionable order. The rite of the first evening in Canaan is just one of the many examples of how the religion shaped every aspect of life in the antiquity. However, it was not the only tradition that defined relationships between men and women in this society. In the next chapter, we will explore other traditions, matrimonial of the Canaanites, from the arranged marriages to polygamy, and how these practices influenced in the social structure of the region. Marriage in Canaan was the agreement between families, not a personal choice. Since childhood, girls, they were promised to their future husbands in transactions that strengthened alliances and ensured economic benefits. The family of the boyfriend had to pay a dowry to the family of the girlfriend, making up for her exit of the parental home. The higher it was, the social status of the family; the older he was, price of the girlfriend. What she did of marriage, a matter of power and wealth. For the women, marry meant pass from the authority of her father to that of her husband, without possibility of deciding their destiny. Its main function was to procreation, since having children guaranteed the continuity of the family and the economic stability. Fertility was a sacred and social matter. If a woman could not conceive, her husband had right to take another wife or resort to concubines to ensure offspring. In some cases, the marriage included slaves who could become surrogate mothers if the main wife did not give children. Polygamy existed in Canaan, although it was reserved for the rulers and the elite. Peasants, due to their economic limitations, tended to be monogamous. However, even in marriages with only one wife, the man had complete authority over his home. The woman had to be obedient and demonstrate his worth through his working capacity and its fertility. In case of disobedience, she could be punished or even returned to her family. Divorce was possible, but unequal. A man he could repudiate his wife if he considered that she did not comply with their duties, if not gave children, or even if he wanted marry with other women. Instead, a woman could only seek divorce in extreme cases, such as abandonment or severe abuse. And even then, I needed the approval of religious authorities, or the king of the city. If she was found guilty of adultery, she could be stoned or sold into slavery. The upper-class women had more opportunities than peasant women. Some administered properties, directed business, and participated in the temples as priestesses. However, their freedom followed being limited by the religious and social rules. In several city-states, before consummating the marriage, the brides, they should go through a purification ritual in the temples of Astarte. In some cases, this rite included symbolic surrender to the goddess through relations with priests or acts of sacred prostitution. It was believed that this process assured the fertility of marriage and the protection of the gods. The role of the women in Canaan was strictly regulated. Since the birth to old age, its value depended on its ability to marry, obey, and have children. His life was controlled by the family traditions and for the influence of the gods, who determined their destiny. However, the arrival of the Hebrews would radically change these customs. The Israelites, with his strict monotheism, condemned many of these practices and sought to eradicate them. In the next chapter, we will explore the clash between Canaanite and Israelite culture and how this confrontation forever transformed the history of Canaan. The arrival of the Hebrews to Canaan frame the beginning of one of the most decisive confrontations of the history ancient. According to the biblical tradition, the Israelites, led by Joshua, crossed the river Jordan with the mission to conquer the land that God gave them, had promised. But beyond the territorial war, this invasion represented a cultural and religious clash that would completely transform the region. The Canaanites, they lived under a deeply rooted polytheistic system in his society. Their fertility rites, the sacred prostitution, and the human sacrifices were practices common, accepted, and promoted by the religious elite. For the Hebrews, these customs were abominations that had to be eradicated. They believed that Canaan was corrupted by the idolatry and that the only way to establish a just society was to destroy its temples, gods, and customs. The first great battle was fought in Jericho, one of the most fortified cities in Canaan. According to the biblical story, the walls of Jericho fell after 7 days of marches and the sound of trumpets, allowing the Hebrews to take the city and exterminate all its inhabitants. For the Israelites, this victory was not only military but also spiritual, a divine punishment against a people who had defied God with their practices pagans. Throughout the campaign of conquest, the Hebrews destroyed several cities and eradicated Canaanite cults. In their place, they established a system based in the Mosaic law, which prohibited the worship of others' gods and condemned with severity the practices of the village's local, sacred prostitution. The human sacrifices and the rite of the first evening were abolished under penalty of death. However, the transition was not immediate nor total. In many regions, the Israelites lived together with the Canaanites for generations, adopting some of their customs and facing constant challenges to maintain his religious identity. In some moments, the Hebrews fell in the idolatry, worshipping Baal and Astarte, which caused internal conflicts and the anger of their own prophets. The fight for Canaan was not just a military conflict, but a war of beliefs. While the Canaanites defended their traditions ancestral, the Hebrews imposed a new order based in his pact with Yahweh. With time, the influence Canaanite disappeared and the region was transformed in the center of monotheism, giving rise to a history that would change the course of the civilization. But although the Hebrews, they conquered Canaan, the memory of the ancient rituals Canaanites did not completely disappear. Some of their myths and customs were recorded in texts and legends that have reached us days. In the next chapter, we will explore what occurred with Canaanite culture after the arrival of the Israelites and how his legacy has endured throughout the history. With the expansion of the Hebrews in Canaan, Canaanite culture began to crumble. The city-states that had dominated the region for centuries were conquered, destroyed, or absorbed into the new social and religious structure imposed by the Israelites. War, migration, and the assimilation forced. They caused the gradual disappearance of the identity Canaanite, but although their temples were razed and their gods forgotten, their influence did not completely fade away. Archaeological remains have revealed that for generations, the Israelites continued living together with populations Canaanite women. In some cases, they adopted traditions local, including certain agricultural practices and architectural elements. Although the Bible presents the conquest as a total eradication, the evidence suggests that the cultural integration was a slower and more complex process. One of the more aspects interesting of the Canaanite legacy is its impact on the language and writing. The Phoenician alphabet descended directly from Canaanite writing. It became the basis of writing systems used throughout the ancient world, influencing into Greek, the Latin, and many modern languages. In addition, some Canaanite place names and religious terms were incorporated into the Hebrew texts, which shows that, although the Israelites rejected Canaanite polytheism, they could not completely erase their inheritance. The references to the Canaanites in the Bible reflect the tension between the two peoples. Throughout the stories of the Old Testament, the tension is repeatedly mentioned. Canaanite idolatry and its practices prohibited, suggesting that the influence of their culture persisted a lot after the conquest. Prophets like Elijah and Jeremiah, they denounced the cult of Baal, indicating that some Hebrews continued practicing it secretly. Despite his disappearance as a civilization independent, the impact of Canaan extends to our days. Their myths, rituals, and beliefs have been studied by historians and archaeologists, revealing a fascinating and complex world. But beyond their cultural influence, the Canaan story reminds us, as the civilizations, they can be transformed or destroyed by the conflicts of power and religion. Although the Hebrews, they triumphed in the fight for Canaan, the memory of this town, ancient, still persists in the ruins of their temples, in the texts that they mention, and in the footprints they left in the cultures that happened. The history of Canaan is the story of a world that disappeared, but whose legacy lives on in the pages of the history. In the next chapter, we will make a final reflection on everything we have learned and how these facts ancient follow resonating in the current events. The story of Canaan is a reflection of how the beliefs and customs can define the destiny of a people. For centuries, this land was a melting pot of cultures, wars, and rituals that seem to us today unthinkable. Their cities, they were prosperous, their temples imposing, and their religion a dominant force in everyday life. But the arrival of the Hebrews changed everything. What for the Canaanites was sacred, for the Israelites it was an abomination. What had been a tradition millenary was eradicated by a new vision of the world. The rite of the first night, the human sacrifices, and the sacred prostitution disappeared with the time, but they leave us a testimony of how different the morality in the ancient world. It makes us ask ourselves, until what spot the religion can justify practices that we consider unthinkable today? How many traditions that today we accept will be seen as barbarities in the future? Canaan's past still alive in the ruins of their temples, in the stories that the Hebrews left on them, and in the archaeology that reveals to us the secrets of a vanished civilization. Now I want to know your opinion. Already, did you know these practices of Canaanite culture? What do you think about this clash of civilizations? Leave me your comment and tell me that others historical mysteries you would like to explore in upcoming videos. If this story surprised you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any more fascinating stories about the past. See you in the next video.